We're now going to take a look at procedural terrains and different ways we can edit and modify them. Do want to note a couple of things. We have two different terrain icons on the left. The standard height field terrain, which is based on elevation, black and white data, and of course the procedural terrain. If you left click on the standard height field terrain, it will create a standard terrain. If you left click on the one with the F, which represents function, being a procedural, it will create a procedural terrain. If you right click on the standard height field, it will create height field terrain in editor. Now this resolution is going to set a default for all future terrains that are created. By default, it's 256 by 256. Go ahead and click OK, and what it's going to do is create a terrain 256 by 256, already the default. I'm going to right click and change the height to 512 and click OK. Now we can see that we have 256 by 512. This will also affect how the filters are run. So if you want more of a stretched out terrain, then you would change that pixel resolution. This does also affect procedural terrains. So now I'm going to add in a new procedural terrain, and we can see 256 by 512. This will also modify the scale. Now if we take a look at the unit system, going to File, Options, Units and Coordinates, my internal unit is set to 0.1 meters. And because of the way the resolution is set up, we can see, looking at the scale in the numerics tab, the X is 25.6 meters and the Y is 51.2, so 256, 512. Change the internal unit to 1 meter, and now we're going to have 256 meters by 512. So that pixel resolution also defines the scale of the initial terrain that's created. So if we do 512 by 512 and create a standard terrain, we have 512 meters by 512. Of course, depending on the internal unit being used. Set it to 0.1, and now it's 51.2. Now this is just the display unit, although it does affect the way vectors are controlled within the function editor. And we'll take a look at that a little later, once we actually get into the function editor. So what I want to do is now create a procedural terrain, and we can see we're using that 512 by 512 as the new default. Right click, go to Edit Object, and we can see the procedural terrain. Now there's a zero edges mode, and with the standard terrain, clicking on zero edges will create more of a mound and continually subtract from the terrain. Using zero edges in a procedural terrain is either an on or off function. So zero edges is on, we get that mound look. Turning it off opens up and shows the entire procedural. Now the mapping mode of procedural terrains is very important. So if we go over to the procedural tab, we can see by default we have an object parametric mode set for the mapping. There's object, object parametric, world, and world parametric. Parametric modes are similar to the object and world modes, except they will fit to stretch directions. So if we have more stretching on the Y or on the X, and it's not completely square, it will fit to that stretch direction. And it works sort of like an auto-fit mode. Now, what I'm going to do is change this from the object parametric mode to the world mode. Before I do that, I just want to show you, while I'm in the object mode, I can modify this terrain, scale it, and it's going to remain looking exactly the same. It's not going to change. I'm also going to go ahead and load in Camera Orbiter just by loading the graph, just so we can get a little better control over the camera within the scene. So now it'll be a little easier to navigate around. So if you own Snowflake from asileFX, you'll be able to use Camera Orbiter, get a little better idea of the scene by using an orbital camera. Okay, so changing the scale does not affect anything. It constrains that function that's tied to the terrain, and resizing makes no change. So let's go ahead and switch over to the world mode. We're going to be asked if we'd like to preserve the current geometry of the terrain. What this is going to do is keep whatever terrain you currently see and swap it over to the world mode, because the coordinate system will be different. With the world mode, the current fractal we have generating this altitude is going to be very small. So we're going to click yes. And if we take a look at the function, before what we had was a seed and a simple fractal. By changing it to world and adding that adjustment to keep the current scale, it's added a matrix transformation and added in a little more to the vector. And that preserves the scale. So now we have basically the same terrain, but the difference is once we scale it, we're no longer scaling that fixed amount, we're adding to it. So if we feel we need a little more of the terrain around the edges, we can scale it and still retain that information we had of the original terrain, never losing that, just expanding on the terrain. This is also independent of the Z position. Moving the Z position will not move you through the fractal unless you set it up that way. Actually, we can do that. Edit the function, and if we change this position input node, right-click, add input, and change it to position options, or choose position options, and set our position type to world standard, and now connect from the original position to position options, we now have a terrain that is going to move through the fractal. So this will change as the Z scale is changed and the Z position. So whether or not that's something you want, you can create some really nice erosion effects this way and some neat animations, but for the most part it does make it difficult to work with the world terrain. The original setup for procedural terrains as of early View 7 and also View 6, it would move through it, but that was changed later to stay fixed with the position, ends up working a little bit better. So if I delete just clicking and highlighting all of those nodes and just work with the original seed and simple fractal, we're going to see the actual size of that fractal showing up in relation to the scale of the terrain. You can see it's very small because this is the true world mode. So what I'm going to do is switch out this fractal. First, I'm just going to delete the seed. We don't need that right now. And I'm going to change our type of fractal from a simple to the terrain fractal, which generates a really nice looking terrain. Now, while you're working on terrains within the function editor, designing a procedural terrain, it can be difficult to really see what's going on unless you use some of the tools available. So if we take a look in the function editor, up at the upper right, we have two different buttons that really help out. What it is the function output observer, which allows us to preview the fractal we're working on. This will also allow you to preview materials and other areas of the program where the function editor is available. And there's also the function node preview, which is an XYZ numeric preview where we can see kind of a cutout at the specific origin point. So we could also change the origin and move through the preview. So we can tell by looking at the output observer that the terrain is still too small. We would need to change some of these size settings. One thing you can do is change the scale of your preview. And you can select to auto fit only when saturating, which will base it and the preview based on the scale of the Z of the terrain. If your Z axis is up, or it's going to show the true output, or just the full output between 0 and 1, which sometimes can get cut off. So sometimes you will need to click only when saturating, turn it on and off in order to get an accurate preview. It kind of triggers something in the program, and that feature has always been kind of touchy. But what I want to do is increase the wavelength if we wanted to, and make that a little larger to scale the overall fractal. Or we can change settings like metascale and largest feature. Now the largest feature is going to be basically the largest mountain area of the terrain. So if we bring that up to 40, we're going to increase the largest mound that we're going to see. So we'll zoom back out to a scale of 1. And if we bring the largest feature up to 100, we can now see that reflect within the output observer. And now metascale is a grouping of the largest feature. Any time you have a metascale lower than the largest feature, it is not active. So if I set the metascale to 1000, now what it's going to do is group the largest feature in a range of 1000. Meta meaning larger than, so larger than the largest feature. And it's more of a mountain range scale as described by Eon. So this way we can increase the overall size and then have a metascale, which is a larger than area. So this is a little difficult to see at the moment because our scale within the scene hasn't been adjusted to this new fractal. So I am going to make one change really quick. There's a lot of different noise landscape types. I'm going to switch over to billows and just click OK. And then close out the terrain editor and increase that Z scale. And this is going to give us a really nice looking terrain. So let's go ahead and take a look at a little render without any specific material on it. So now we can see just the terrain itself, which is that default material. We've got some really nice distribution of a couple of different fractals that are included within the terrain fractal, and automatically generating smooth areas and some really nice features overall. So a lot of different ways to control it, and it ends up being probably one of the best fractals at the moment. Now, these smooth areas we can actually connect to control material distributions, which is pretty cool. And I'm going to show you that really quick before we move on to some of the areas and other points. Now, you may notice in my preview I'm not seeing the entire terrain. I'm currently recording this in the pre-release version, and whether or not this setting was changed, we'll have to see. But currently the zone, which we'll take a look at in a minute, is set to the original scale. So if I have to, I can add in a new zone, draw out the full size of the terrain, and now we can see the entire terrain. So whether or not that's going to dynamically update with the final version, I'm not sure. It should. But if it doesn't, then you can just draw out a new specific zone. We'll take a look at zones in a little later, once we start looking at the painting and different areas and other areas of the terrain editor. But what I want to show you is how we can connect two different materials to be controlled by those smooth zones. Now, there's a couple of different settings for the noise variation. Smooth areas, a higher amount is going to decrease the amount of smooth areas. And then you can adjust the altitude and then the strength of the transition between the smooth zones and then the rockier surface, which would be the billows or the ridges. But there is a feature that is currently grayed out, and it's the second output detect rough areas. This applies almost exclusively to Terrain Fractal and some of the new filters in View 8 being the recursive filters. A lot of the older fractals, although they may have a detect rough area, they may not work. It's really something that's going to work specifically for the terrain fractal. So what I'm going to do is right-click and add a custom dependency as an output node. What we can do is connect this custom dependency to the bottom of the terrain, and we're given two options. Altitude is the primary output. Rough areas is going to be a distribution of the smooth areas and sort of a transition between them. So let's call this smooth areas. And I just added a few brackets in there because every time I make a custom dependency, I like to add the brackets to really separate these from the rest of the nodes in the scene, and you'll understand that once we pull it up for the material. What I'm going to do in order to preview this smooth area is disconnect, select the connection between altitude and the terrain fractal, hit delete, and reconnect, connecting to the rough area. This will give us a preview of the output and the distribution. We can now adjust the reference feature size to give ourselves a preview of the distribution that we will see if we connect this to possibly control two different materials. So let's use a value a little higher, maybe around 11. And it's just a nice little preview. And then we'll go back, disconnect, bring that back to altitude. And I'm going to go ahead and click OK. And then close out and click OK to close the terrain editor. Now we could use a mixed material, kind of like we did in the previous area of the training, but I'm going to show you a different technique using the alpha output and using a layered material this time. So I'm going to start out by loading in a new material. We're going to go to material layers because I don't want a mixed material, and we're going to start with the simple grass. So this is going to apply grass to the entire terrain. There's no distribution at the moment. I do want to note I do have auto update turned off within the main camera preview. You can turn that on and off and also set the preview quality. I'm going to set it over to fast. You can also set whether or not you want it to take priority over the rest of the scene. I do want to note that it does only use one core of your system to render. So sometimes it's actually quicker just to render the actual scene than to watch the preview and wait for it to update. Because if you're using an 8-core system, a full render is going to still be a lot quicker than waiting for one core to render a preview. So just one thing to keep in mind. Let's go up to double-click on the material in the aspect tab. And what I want to do is add in a layer. Let's go ahead and distribute this with some rock. I'm going to use the large-scale rock, still from material layers. And if we go over to the environment tab, a lot of these material layers will have some environment settings preset that saves with it. And these settings will also carry over to ecosystem layers once they're added. If I select the simple grass and move it up above the large scale rock, so it's now on top, we take a look at the environment, we can see that it also has some of these environment settings set to it, and also an alpha boost. So I'm going to move that down, select the large scale rock. With the alpha boost at 0, it's going to give us the pure alpha production, so we'll see that in just a sec. I'm going to take the environment and just kind of reset these, so there's no fuzziness on the slope, and the constraint, the range, is open all the way, so -1 to 1. Okay, so now we have a full coverage of rock on the entire terrain. And what I want to do is take that output that we grabbed from that terrain in order to subtract from this. And for that, we can use the alpha. So rather than using a mixed material and controlling distribution, I'm going to use a layered material, which works a little differently. And now we can define how we're going to cut it away with the alpha. So let's go ahead and change our preview options. Up here at the upper left, pull down menu, preview options. I'm going to change this to terrain. And this is going to change the preview within the overall layout. So if we want to change the output observer, we need to change the main preview within the material editor. So now we can control click on that preview to open back up the function, and I'm going to right click, add input node, external dependency. When we click to choose our dependency, we can see all of the objects in the scene. The primary dependencies for just about everything is position, orientation, size, and pivot offset. And now we can see that smooth area with the brackets, and that's why I added the brackets, because it stands out from the rest. So now we can see that custom dependency in there as well. Every object has position, orientation, size, and pivot offset, except the main camera is not going to have size, and we do have a lot of other options available for cameras. But the main primary ones are there, and we can also see for lights there are some additional options. These allow you to make graph connections and really some nice dynamic connections between objects and do some really advanced stuff. But let's just take a look at using the smooth area. And we can now connect this directly to the alpha. And we're going to start to see a preview. Now, we might need to edit the output. Go ahead and take a look at the output observer, or the function node preview, to see the total range. And what we want is a range between -1 and +1. All of the number outputs are going to work between -1, +1, and in this case we really don't have any areas that are going below 0. So unless we have this number going down to -1, there's not going to be an even distribution. So we can either set up a filter if we wanted to maybe pull it down a little, but I'm going to just select that link that we had, and we can add in a filter which will automatically grab that, add it to the chain. I'm going to change this over to the offset. What this will allow me to do is move down the output. So now we're falling below. And what I want is something fairly equal, where we can see the top and the bottom are going to be the same, but one positive, one negative. So what I'm hoping to achieve right now is to get the highest points at 0.5 and the low points at -0.5. And now we need to increase the amount so that we're raising the peaks up to 1 and taking the lower parts and pulling them down to -1. So I'm going to add in another filter. And we're going to change this over to gain. And now we can adjust the gain. Brightness and contrast can also work for this. But let's go ahead and take a look. See this distribution. And if we need to swap which areas they're showing on, we can use an invert or an opposite output. which is going to reverse which material is going to be showing. So I'll just let this finish up. And it looks like I do have the rock more on the smoother areas, and I do want a reverse. So actually, I will just go ahead, cancel this really quick, and go back into the material. Under the alpha, we're going to grab that link. We're going to add in another filter and change it to opposite -x. This is going to give us a reverse output and an exact opposite setting. So we'll go ahead and render that out and we can take a look. So now we can see that by using the smooth area output, we're controlling the material distribution and showing the grass on those smoother zones. Now we might need to make some additional adjustments either to the scale of the smooth area output or adjusting that alpha in order to adjust the edges. And if we were to have a different layering setup where we had the grass on top of the rock rather than the other way around, we wouldn't need to use that opposite -x filter to reverse it, at least in order to achieve this look. And we can also use the alpha boost in order to increase some of the contrast, but really this is going to work more as a sort of an offset, raising the alpha up and down, just as we saw before in that function node preview. And if we wanted a little sharper of a transition between the rock and the grass, what we could do is add another filter, and really what would work best is using brightness and contrast. And we could increase the contrast. There's also a smooth threshold that will really cut it out. And if we take a look, you can see what the smooth threshold looks like. Setting a transition amount, how much is carried over, creates a very sharp cutoff. Brightness and contrast works similarly to the gain when you're using contrast, but the brightness too adds another element to it. So there's a lot of ways to refine it. I'm going to go ahead and just adjust the lighting really quick. Take the sunlight, just go into the atmosphere editor, F4 on the keyboard, or atmosphere editor. In the sun tab, raise the pitch up slightly and just kind of rotate around the sun and the scene. Move over to the light tab, and we'll make it a little more ambient. Double click on the sunlight, pull down the shadow amount and the density in the shadows tab. Actually, I will go back to that light balance and maybe increase a little more towards sunlight and dip the sun down a little lower. So let's take a look at adding another object into the scene, which is the sea object. And if we look to the upper left of our icons in the toolbar, what we have is the infinite planes. There's water, ground, and a cloud layer. If you're using the spectral model, it will add a cloud layer to the cloud layer section. If you're using a volumetric model, it will use a cloud infinite plane, just like a ground plane, and map a material to it. Same thing with the standard model. But the first option we have is water, and that's the sea object. So go ahead and click on that and add it into the scene. Now we're not really seeing it at the moment because our terrain is above where the water is. So what we have a couple of options. We could move the terrain down a little lower, or we could lift the sea up. I'm going to keep the sea object at 0. If we go to the numerics tab and we take a look at the position, which is the first section, and under Z we can see we have 100 centimeters. I'm going to set it down to just 0. So now we know the sea is going to be at 0. This will be a good reference when we add our next material layer to this procedural terrain. So I'm going to select our procedural terrain and move it down below the water object. Now we're not really seeing anything below the water because we have a ground plane. I'm going to drop the ground plane a little lower in the scene so that we can start to see the transparency of the water itself. And because the sea object does have a foam layer, it's actually sampling from the foam layer to generate this transparency and the color of the wireframe. We can change the wireframe color if needed in the display. If you go to the Aspect tab, and right where we see this A, this is the automatic preview color. We can also set a specific color. If we set it to blue, we're going to see a full blue. The only thing is we're going to lose the transparency. So sometimes it's better to use the automatic mode. And if we take a look at the sea object material, we have foam and then a default water surface underneath it. These are connected to the controls and the internal function within the sea object. So if I right click, edit the sea object, it's going to pull up the water surface options where we can adjust the altitude or the Z position if you have Z as the up axis, which we just did in the numerics tab. Those are exactly the same. As we modify surface altitude, it will also modify that Z. Click OK, and we can see that reflected. Bring it down to 0. And there's a global wave control going between calm and storm, which is going to adjust everything except the wind direction and which way the waves are traveling. If we turn that off, it's going to open up all the rest of these options, adjusting foam along the coastlines, which is based on the distance to the object below. So as the terrain extends, underneath the water surface, it'll increase foam amounts, and also the foam on the higher peaks of the waves. I'm just going to use the global wave control. And another option is the displaced water surface. What this is going to do is make the water act as a procedural terrain, displacing the actual object. Like I said, it will behave just like a procedural terrain with that wave surface on it, and displace the geometry. And it will take a little longer to render. Of course, it looks much better in its true geometry waves rather than modifying the bump channel. So you can also edit the function of these waves, and you can see the wave meta node, where we can make fine-tuned adjustments to the surface of the water. Also, smaller waves, and you can even edit the graph and go in and see exactly what's making up this overall displacement. And really they're using the open ocean fractal, which has been around for a little while and creates some really nice waves, but now it's all kind of tied together in one object as of View 7. I'm going to turn that off, and we're just going to stick with a regular water surface. And if we take a look at the preview, because of the scale of the scene and the way the water is set up, we're going to notice that the clarity of the water is very high. It's not going to be very murky. So I'll let this finish up really quick. Rendering, we can take a look. So there's just a little bit left here to render, but we can see how clear the water is. And really this is because a lot of the default settings for this water, it's really expecting a much larger scene. Now we can go in and fine-tune a lot of these settings to adjust the water. But really I want to use a lot of these automatic controls so I don't have to go in and fine-tune and tweak everything to get it to look good. So what I want to do is increase the size of the terrain and get it to fit a little bit better with the controls of the water surface. So I'm going to go ahead and cancel this render, just hitting escape on the keyboard, and zoom out a bit. Select our procedural terrain, right-click, edit the object, and rather than increasing the overall scale of the altitude production, I am going to edit the function, increase the wavelength up to 10 from 1. And then we can just click OK to close that. And we're not really worrying about the zone right now, so it may not show the entire terrain. And then we'll just go ahead and click OK to close this out. And we'll increase the scale on both the Z and the overall scale. and just kind of reposition. And I'm going to take that ground and make sure that it is far below. I really just want to have the ground there for the distant parts of the scene, since I'm not using an infinite terrain. And we're going to see something that's going to look a little bit better now. I am going to adjust the terrain just a little bit more, pulling up the z-axis and creating a little more interesting islands. And if you're paying attention to where those smooth areas come about too, you can align that with the water so it adjusts the coast a little better. I'm going to go ahead and switch this over just to a preview render, just to get a quick idea of what it looks like, and be able to see the changes. Obviously, in the clarity of the water, it's much murkier now. It looks a lot deeper. To adjust that setting, so if I did want to make it a little clearer or even murkier, we can select the sea object, go into its material, or we could go over to the material tab and just go directly into the material. Once again, there's two primary materials, the foam, and then there's also the default water, which is the main water surface. Under the transparency tab, there's a fading out value where we can adjust between clear and murky. So this is the way to override the default settings and choose whether or not we want a really murky surface or something clear. So that control is open. The refraction index set to 1.33, automatic. What we can also do is take the subray quality drop and reduce that. Now what this is going to do is improve render speed because we have a displaced surface with reflections and transparency, but because it's so distorted, we don't really need an exact calculation of those values. So what we can do is reduce the subray quality for reflections and some of the transparency. It makes it a little easier to work with some of these water objects. And let's make a few manual changes, selecting the sea object, right-click, edit the object, turn off the global wave control, and now we can adjust the foam along coasts, and adjust the depth, which is going to be really dependent on the distance of the objects below, and how much of the terrain is extending out beyond the water surface for the full coverage, and then we can adjust the overall amount. And then we can change some of the water settings as well, the intensity of the wind, how agitated it is, if there's choppiness, and then the overall wave coverage if you want to have some bigger waves, wave amount, and we'll just make a few changes there. And there's one thing I like to do to increase the specular look of the water, to make it the glare and the surface glare look a little more realistic. So if we go back into the material for the sea, under default water, go to the highlight and change it to an anisotropic setting. And that will give a little bit of a better glare off the surface. Something that usually looks a little more realistic. And if you need to adjust some of the other settings on the foam, maybe you could lighten it up a bit. Sometimes I go into the foam setting, and if you go to the effects tab, we can give it sort of a luminous value. That'll make it much whiter, a little bit brighter. And we'll start to see that foam showing. I'm going to make one modification to the surface of the terrain. And I'm going to add in a new layer, selecting the brown sand. So now we have a new layer on top, and this one I just want to control with the Environment tab. I'm going to switch over to the Absolute mode, and we can see the full altitude range of the terrain, negative 141 meters to 128. Because we kept the sea object at 0, we know that the sea level starts at 0. So therefore we can start the sand going below and then just up to where the water meets. So I'll go ahead and set this to 1 meter. And increase the slope range to full amount and add a little bit of fuzziness on top so it's blending into the terrain. Now there's also an alpha that is included with this brown sand. I'm going to right click and reset the function for the alpha, which is just going to remove that connection, and that way we don't have to go into the function editor to make those changes. What I also want to do is adjust the overall color, and we can right click, edit color, and I'm just going to lighten it up a little bit, maybe make it a little more desaturated. And that's going to be an overall color change to the entire surface of the material, kind of an overlaid color. And we might need to adjust the rough areas and the smooth area since that scale has now changed for the terrain. So I'm going to do a quick preview and just see how the material looks and whether or not that needs to be changed. But we'll start to see that sand showing up more along the shoreline and, of course, underneath the water surface. And I am going to increase the range of that sand, bring it up a little bit higher. Let's go ahead and do 2 meters. And maybe we could also increase the fuzziness, which is going to raise up slightly above that 2 meters and blend it in a little bit more. And if I go into that overall color, maybe I'll lighten it up a little more, make it more of a white. And we'll zoom out a little farther. Something a little bit higher up. And I'm going to go ahead and render this out. So now we can see the final render of this, and it does look like we might need to make a few modifications to maybe the murkiness level, adjusting some of the foam slightly, maybe the wind direction. But overall, it gives you a pretty good sense of how you can use the sea object. I also want to note that there's not just the one material for the sea object. You can load in some of the other ones that are available, and of course customize and make your own. If we select the sea and go to load in a material, the additional sea object materials are located under liquids and labeled as meta waters. So there's the default, which is the one that always loads in, and then channel water and also the wavy shore. So there are a couple of different settings you can use. And with the wavy shore loaded in, I'm going to go ahead and just kind of zoom into one of these areas and see if we can see that foam showing. And it looks like, in this case, with this water, the terrain might be a little large. To switch this over to a preview, and you're going to end up with an entirely different type of wave surface. I also want to note, too, this is all, of course, can be animated. This fractal, the open ocean, and any of the meta waters are all automatically animated. This one creates more of a rolling wave using this meta water, and these will come into the shore. They won't overlap onto the terrain. What you would have to do in that case is copy the foam surface over onto the terrain itself and do a lot of tweaking and editing to get that to work out. But of course it can be animated over time. So in this case, if we wanted to just animate this shoreline what we could do is hit F11 on the keyboard, and that's automatically going to open the animation wizard. I'm just going to close that out. We can scroll into the timeline. Let's say we want to do 4 seconds, and we'll just create a keyframe. Let's just do it for the main camera. So with the main camera selected, we'll add a position keyframe. That's automatically going to trigger an animation. And if we wanted to get a quick preview, we can see this little film canister over here, little film. Right click, and we can set the mode we want to render the preview in, a couple of different size options, and then the preview frame rate. And then you can just left click on it, and it's going to render out a preview of the animation. So I do have auto exposure on, which is why we saw that first frame kind of jumped up a little higher. But through the animation, you'll see the waves, and gives you a nice quick preview of what it's going to look like. So everything is automatically animated, which is really nice. It's all tied directly to time, and you can decrease or increase some of the settings by going into the function and modifying that connection. I'm just going to go ahead and cancel this, and we'll be able to see it starting to play, but just some of those waves coming in. And then you can also scrub through and see how it's going to look throughout the frames. So really, this would need a few modifications, like I was saying, to the water and also to the material itself, since we changed it before we scaled it. Throw an ecosystem layer on top of it, and you've got yourself a little island chain. But we're going to move on to other types of using procedural terrains and take a look at infinite terrains.